Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Atlantic Council after an event on human rights in Russia, and we are absolutely honored to have with us Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is one of Russia's most prominent opposition leaders with Open Russia. I want to ask you very quickly about the message that the President of the United States and how important the words of the President of the United States are for democracy movements around the world. I remember my family was in the Soviet Union when I visited them in 2005. There was a Reagan-Bush sticker, and they said it's because President Reagan had the courage to call it the evil empire. How important are the words of the American president for global democracy movements?
Well, first of all, it's only up to the Russian people to change the political situation in Russia, to make sure we have a government based on rule of law, on democratic institutions and respect for human rights. It's not the job of Mr. Trump or Mrs. Merkel or Mrs. May or anybody else among Western leaders. It is only our job. What we do ask of leaders of Western democracies, including the government here in the United States, is first of all to be honest about what is happening in Russia and to call things for what they are. And secondly, and very importantly, to abide by the principles that they claim to espouse. And if Western countries are based, if Western systems are based on respect for rule of law, respect for democratic institutions, and respect for human rights, then Western countries should not serve as havens for the people in and around Vladimir Putin's close circle, officials, the oligarchs who are engaged in human rights abuse or corruption. And we know very well that for many years, those people have used Western countries to keep their money, to send their families, to buy real estates, palaces, mansions, yachts, vineyards, as we now know. And we think this is hypocritical. And we think that the most important thing Western democracies can do is stay true to the principles that they espouse, and to live by those principles, and to stop serving as havens for corruption, human rights abuse, and this certainly includes the United States.
And so measures like the Magnitsky Act, two-part question. First, how big and serious of a threat is Vladimir Putin to Western democracies, not just in Europe, but elsewhere, particularly in Europe and even in the United States? And in terms of countering them, are targeted sanctions regimes like Magnitsky Act more important than sort of broad brush techniques?
Well, in terms of the threat, of course, Vladimir Putin's regime is primarily a threat to the Russian people, whose rights he has been violating for 17 years now. And, of course, it's also a threat to the outside world. I mean, this is a frequent occurrence in history that authoritarian regimes combine domestic repression with external aggression and external adventurism, and this is what Mr. Putin's regime has certainly been doing, both in Europe and apparently now in other places as well. As you know, there is a lot of talk about the Kremlin's interference in the US election in 2016. In terms of the targeted sanctions, first of all, I think this is what's right in principle. We're against sanctions on Russia. We're against sanctions on the Russian people. The West shouldn't punish the Russian people for the actions of a regime that is not democratically elected, that the Russian people cannot remove in the free election because we don't have any. And sanctions should be directed at those individuals in the regime who are engaged in human rights abuse and corruption. And when the Magnitsky Law was passed a little more than 4 years ago, Boris Nemtsov, the late leader of the Russian opposition, called it the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign parliament because it targeted those who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who plunder the resources of Russian taxpayers. And I think it's those kind of sanctions, individual sanctions, not sanctions on Russia, sanctions on those individuals, individual crooks and human rights abusers, that is the best way forward.